All right, welcome back to Chapter 9. Today we'll be talking about musical theater. I know that some of you love musical theater and others of you vehemently hate it. It's usually a love hate kind of situation. And so if you're on the camp of hating it, bear with us. It'll be over in one lecture. I'll sneak it in other places, but hopefully that will be of some consolation to you. You can see in your D2L there are lots and lots of clips for you to watch. As you may imagine, musical theater is the kind of thing, choreography, stylization, it's a lot easier for me to show you than to tell you. And once again, I'm sorry that sometimes it's kind of buried in other content you don't have to know, but those clips are pretty conveniently cut down to 2 or 3 minutes apiece. So I tried to be as diligent with your time as possible. What is musical theater? Well, theater has always had a musical component as far back as we can remember. Theater, there has been music involved. For example, in your book here, he says how the dancing happened. If you're on page 247 with me, he talks about the flute that was used in ancient Greek tragedy and how rhythmically they chanted, according to Aristotle. And then Shakespeare, of his 38 plays, 25 of them had songs written in, and like we discussed earlier, it was specifically for his clown who could sing, and so the one playing the fool was usually the one who had the song. So the musical interludes were a big part in Shakespeare's day too, where little unrelated songs would be stuck into the storyline. And then we have Moliere, and in France, and he had these ballets and operettas that we can see. And then, of course, all of the Asian theater you could see had dancing and singing and drums and flutes and lutes and different sort of dramatic elements. But what we think of as musical theater is about 150 years old, and it is the good old American musical is definitely one of our biggest art forms because it's a combination of all things American. So it would be amiss if we didn't take just a moment to talk about good old Broadway. There I am standing in front of the Richard Rodgers Theater on a cool December evening, getting ready to see Cyrano de Bergerac, which was a beautiful play. And it's worth mentioning at this moment, too, that I went to go see a straight play on Broadway. I wasn't seeing a musical. So if you recall, Eugene O'Neill premiered on Broadway, had a lot of runs on Broadway, and those were straight plays. And so Broadway is a combination of both. But it is a street, right? It's a street in New York City. I'm sure some of the streets that you are from have a Broadway. The literal term there is just the broadest street in the town, right? But Broadway in New York City runs around 42nd Street, no, 41st to 50th Street, and is the theater district. Now, if you go to London, they have a theater district called the West End. If you go to Chicago, they have a theater district, and so Broadway just happens to be the most famous theater district in the world. All of this theater houses on Broadway, if it is an official Broadway theater house, it has over 1,000 seats. So these are over the top, really big opera houses with large spectacles going on. These are not small personal theater houses. Tickets are expensive on Broadway. Usually around $75 is the cheapest ticket that you can get. Now, there are exceptions to that. If you can go and get a last-minute student rush ticket or something like that. But for the most part, theater tickets on Broadway are not cheap. And it is a big tourist attraction. You know, if somebody came from another country, they want to see an American-style musical. And it is the biggest tourist attraction in the U.S. So I know these numbers are a little bit outdated, but in 2011, $12.11 million were made on Broadway. So, how did Broadway begin? It began with the Black Crook, which were a group of Parisian ballerinas, and they were stranded in New York City. Now, some people would say there were operas and other things in that same district, but this is sort of scandalously considered America's, beginning to Broadway, because these Parisian ballerinas did not wear tights, and so that was sort of our first Broadway exhibition here, is Half Naked Ladies, which we definitely continued in that vein of Half Naked Ladies. Now, so Broadway is a melting pot, very famously. A lot of the writers, Hammerstein, Ziegfeld, a lot of these guys are very Jewish. Stephen Sondheim writes about how the importance of music in the Jewish faith has led so many composers to be of Jewish descent. Let me say that again. Stephen Sondheim talks about how music is so instrumental in the spirituality of Judaism, and how that sort of prompts many Jewish men to become composers. Well, it's also kind of proximity, right? In New York City, where these Broadway productions are going up, that's a very Jewish part of town. And so perhaps the reason we have so many producers and composers who are Jewish could be because of where they are. Another thing that's interesting to think about is many Jewish composers were writing about cities they'd never been to. We look at Oklahoma. Rodgers and Hammerstein had never been to the Midwest. Why didn't they choose to write something like Fiddler on the Roof until the 60s? Well, you have to remember that culture was sort of not as popular to exhibit if you were not good old American blonde hair and blue eyes. Until the 60s, there was a lot of Jewish people who were changing their names, their stage names, into something less Jewish. There wasn't exactly the pride that we have nowadays. Even in West Side Story, which was in the 50s, it was originally supposed to be about a Jewish girl, but and an Irish Catholic, but they decided to make it more. They didn't feel like America was ready. There was still some lingering anti-Semitism, so they decided to make it about Puerto Rican and Polish. But of course, tap dancing comes from the Irish tradition of clogging, and perhaps the most important ingredient we have in this melting pot is the African American jazz age, jazz hands, and the importance of the horns in the American musical style is very much right out of the African American jazz. The British drinking halls where they had operettas, Pirates of Penzance, I am the very model of a modern major general, right? Those are very British things that were being presented in America. And so when we hear that patter sound still today in things like Sondheim, pardon me, is everybody there? Because if everybody's there, I'd like to thank you all for coming to the wedding, right? It has that same British operetta patter that was going on in England. And then another important aspect of the American Broadway is vaudeville, right? If you go to the Nashville airport here in Tennessee, you can visit some of these statues of great vaudevillian performers who performed in Nashville, who were native Tennesseans, and their comedy acts and the way that they would do these mime acts were very American as an art form. And these were performed in bars, right? Open sort of guitar case deal where people are basically begging for change. Definitely these bar entertainments greatly influenced and the popular music of the day, which eventually became Broadway. Once again, just reinforcing that this is a money-making business, right? Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark there is a very famous show running in Broadway right now. It was a Julie Taymor experiment with U2, so it's got Bono in it, or Bono, sorry. Bono and U2's music, and it has people, flying around on top of where the flying around up above people's heads. So it's a really fun sort of family-friendly environment. Book of Mormon, that is a scathing criticism of religion in general, but Mormonism in particular. It is a byproduct of the guy who wrote Avenue Q, if you've ever heard of that musical before, and then also South Park. The writers of South Park collaborated on that project. So it is very irreverent. It is very inappropriate humor, if you like that kind of thing. And I think it's very funny. Being a person of faith myself, I still find it very funny. Hugh Jackman, oh, beautiful, beautiful man. He's done some great work in the London stage and then also on Broadway. If you haven't ever seen him in a movie, he was Wolverine. He was in Australia. But he famously was in Oklahoma, the National stage in London. Just a beautiful singer and dancer and husband for so many years, just all around stand-up guy. The War Horse is been turned into a Steven Spielberg movie, but on stage, kind of the magic of this play was a larger-than-life horse, a big puppet horse that was sort of going through all of these different wartime activities, and so big puppets going on there. Jersey Boys is what's called a jukebox musical, and that's where we take popular music and create a review of some kind showcasing that popular music. Something like Dreamgirls would be considered a jukebox musical. Mamma Mia, one of my favorites, Carole King's Tapestry, has been turned into a jukebox musical. So we can kind of relive those concert-style environments, even though the people who originally wrote that music have passed on. How to Succeed in Business Without Really Trying is a revival, right? That was really popular in the 60s, and it's starring a little Harry Potter guy. So that is just kind of an element of Broadway, too, is now how do we get people like Hugh Jackman and Harry Potter guy to sort of bolster our audiences. Follies is another sort of revival. Ziegfeld Follies, with lots of showgirls, and Phantom of the Opera, which we'll get to talking about in just a minute. All right, so as we look at different kind of timeline, from the 1900s to the 1920s, my favorite composer of this time was Cole Porter. At my senior year in high school, I got to play in Anything Goes, which is one of my favorite performances of my career. Just a really fun first step in the way of theater, but they are usually lighthearted, right? More focused around young lovers and the romanticized sort of, one song from Anything Goes is "You're the top, you're the Colosseum," and the whole song, the whole, musical review, the whole entire thing is just a celebration about how great each other is. I mean, this isn't rocket science, and when it comes to lyrics. There was some sex appeal, right? Lots of girls in tights. We're continuing that tradition that the French Parisian dancers started. There's some comedy. There's a lot of patriotism, but that would be just kind of characteristic of America at that time. And it's important here, he points out that there are archetypes rather than fully developed figures. So in Anything Goes, we have a nightclub singer. Reno Sweeney is who I played, a nightclub singer evangelist. So she's sharing, the Christian gospel at the same time that she's sitting on top of a piano. And it's sort of a caricature, a stereotype, a wash of a human being rather than these, complicated and complex characters of modernity we just spoke about. They are more generalized. So the songs, like "You're the Top," that wasn't necessarily progressing a plot. Nothing happened during the song. It's just a little musical interlude for us to enjoy being in love and whatever our circumstances were. So black musicals were happening in Harlem, and a lot of the Jim Crow stories that we had were being toured around the country. So maybe you've heard of Jim Crow before and the Jim Crow laws. What you may not know is that Jim Crow was actually a stereotype created by a white man. And he said things like yassa and nosa, and he would dance, and it was a very racially offensive by today's standard. And he was such a popular character, like I said, that the laws prohibiting African Americans from racially mixing with other whites were named after him, Jim Crow. What happened as more African Americans turned to performing is black people would put on blackface, as explained in that short clip of video that you had. And black theater has always been performed for other African Americans throughout America's history, particularly because they weren't being represented on the stage. So if we look at plays like Raisin in the Sun, or in the 60s, we had a big boom of African American theater because it was heavily supported by the government. And so a lot of plays like The Wiz and Dreamgirls, right? Beautiful tellings by African Americans for African Americans. All right, so we're kind of getting out of the 1925 is about when we see the absolute golden age of theater come into full swing. We see a little bit more sophisticated music, and sometimes we have a current issue going on. For example, in Showboat, right, we have the mixed race going on there, or The King and I, we have international relations as they sort of pertain to conforming to one cultural identity and assimilating there. But the more important thing here that we see is that music and dance is progressing the plot. And we'll come back to that when we talk about Oklahoma in just a minute. Definitely commercial success. So if you turned on the radio, the songs that you would hear were Broadway songs. So when we talk about a lot of gray hairs in the theater nowadays, you see a lot of older people still patronizing the theater. That is partially because in their day, the musical theater was the popular music. So it's almost as if those gray hairs who are living in Florida and going to the theater every night, they're doing that in the same way some of us would go see a concert. Right? They're enjoying the music of their age. And also these touring companies, they would go all around and we would get to hear them live. So the 1950 onwards, we sort of consider the contemporary musical. The choreography became more and more instrumental in telling the story. So no longer do we just have, a dance break where we just enjoy the solo for the sake of the solo. Now the dance is instrumental in helping us tell the story. Sondheim is one of my favorite composer. Well, he is my favorite musical theater composer of all time. You may know him for Into the Woods, or Company, or Sweeney Todd, and we'll talk about him in just a minute. But he's not afraid of a little skepticism. He's not afraid to put in some intricacies to the music. In fact, if you go into an audition as an actress and you want to sing a Stephen Sondheim song and you hand it to the accompanist, they're probably going to roll their eyes and grunt. And it's not unusual to see no Sondheim on an audition casting call because his music is difficult, and syncing yourself up with the accompaniment can be a little more challenging than other composers. Alright, so I'm just going to kind of walk you through 10 important musicals, all of which have accompanying clips. You need to make sure that you know the differences between these musicals and what they look like, so to be prepared for your quiz. Alright, so the first one on page 250 here is Showboat. I love this. Old Man River is one of my favorite songs. It's just a beautiful sort of hopelessness, I guess you could say. If you know the famous Rodgers and Hammerstein, half of that duo, Oscar Hammerstein, wrote both the books and the lyrics in 1927. And Jerome Kern wrote the music. Kern is an also very famous musical theater great. It was the story of interracial love, and half of the performers were African American, and that was a big thing. A lot of, white people had never seen an African American perform, and so a lot of these were white people coming to these plays, though, because they were very expensive to see these plays. Porgy and Bess, right, which was written by the Gershwins, has recently enjoyed a new run on Broadway with Audrey McDonald, if you're a fan of Private Practice. I think she's fabulous. But anyway, she was a beautiful singing voice there. But anyway, there was African Americans coming into Broadway. Unlike the sort of musical concerts of before the 20s, this one actually had a complex plot, and we had to kind of follow the action of the story, so it had a little bit more integrity there. There's a lot of really famous songs from this musical that you would understand. It doesn't get produced a lot because it is ridiculously long by today's standards. So it's not often produced in its entirety, at least. But it is definitely a gritty sort of story about America. All right. Oklahoma, where the wind goes riding through the plains. This is a Rodgers and Hammerstein. So once again, we have Hammerstein making the record books here. But Rodgers and Hammerstein would go on to do many musicals together, such as The King and I, Sound of Music, often considered sort of sentimental in nature, that they are sort of everybody lives happily ever after, but they have a tinge of current issues going over. Sound of Music, if you remember, has the Nazism. The King and I has gender prejudice. South Pacific, racial prejudice. Carousel, spousal abuse. So it is these Rodgers and Hammerstein stories do have a little bit of grit to them. So Oklahoma, what's such a big deal about Oklahoma? One thing is the entire ballet scene, where our main character, she has a dream, and in this dream she's worried about a flirtation that she's had with a guy who kind of scares her, and she really has a crush on a guy named Curly. And so when the acting out of this dream sequence, there's not any words, but the entire story is told through dance, particularly through ballet. And it was just a big, strong choice, and sort of opened up past this just girls barely clad standing in a kick line, kind of expanded the boundaries of what we could include in an American musical, and push the boundaries of what is included in this art form. And like I said, it does celebrate the American West, even though these Jewish guys had never been out of New York City. And a rural life at that time there, and many times after, there has been sort of a poeticism around rural life in America. Singing in the Rain, this is one of my favorite, and I just felt like I needed to throw in a nod to the relationship between movies and stage musicals. Some of these, like Singing in the Rain, were first brought out in musical form on the movie screen, but then moved to the stage later on in a sentimental kind of way. If you're with me, still on page 251, they kind of talk about some of these movies that made it all the way, Annie Get Your Gun, Pajama Game, Damn Yankees, Brigadoon, and a lot of these big stars that kind of came out of the musical theater that shared both the stage and the screen. Bob Hope, Julie Andrews, Carol Channing, Ethel Merman. And it's not exactly the same way nowadays. We have some people who are more famous on Broadway. Take an actor like Mandy Patinkin, and he is legendary in the musical theater realms, and then he plays these bit parts in movies to pay the rent. Bernadette Peters, she has been successful in both stage and screen pretty universally. Kristen Chenoweth recently did GCB, a TV program, but she's had a somewhat successful film career. But in the musical theater circles, oh, it's Kristen Chenoweth. She is this amazing voice that we really appreciate. So anyway, all of this to say, movies and musicals kind of share stars, and the Singing in the Rain sort of typifies that light-hearted romance, young love that we were talking about, this sort of light fluff pieces, if you will, although I love Singing in the Rain, so I would never call it just a fluff piece. But great dancing, great jazz hands, a lot of the things that we enjoy about the Golden Age musicals. Okay, so once again we have a record breaker here in West Side Story. West Side Story was choreographed by Jerome Robbins, and famously we see these street rumbles with guys with knives in their hands pointing their toes, which is sort of funny for us to look back now. But you have to remember that these people were wearing what was fashionable at the time. They were doing dance moves that were fashionable at the time, so it was very current and it was very close to home. They were depicting what was happening right on the other side of that wall in New York City, which was gang warfare, a pretty hard-hitting topic for a musical. It was the story of a Puerto Rican Maria and a Polish Tony. It's based on Romeo and Juliet, where we see what's popular. We turn on MTV to see what they're wearing and then mimic it, and West Side Story was a trendsetter in a lot of ways. And it gave Stephen Sondheim a start. He was the lyricist on that project and got really an endorsement from a lot of the Broadway community after having worked on that show. All right, Chorus Line. We're still on page 252. Chorus Line is a play by Michael Bennett. Michael Bennett is a dancer, and he is concerned with this sort of evolution away from dancers being just the chorus and being moved into a position where they have to sing, dance, and act. They have to become a triple threat. They have to learn to do it all. It also kind of questions the idea of the anonymous chorus. In something like Ziegfeld Follies or Radio City Music Hall, dancers, the Rockettes are standing in a straight line. They all have the same waist measurement. In a kick line, they're all the same height, and they look like little robots back there dancing for us. And it's very impersonal. We never know one dancer from another. They're just sort of this chorus of dancers. And so to have these plot where we're going through the different individuals and telling their story and how badly they want to be part of a Broadway musical was just a very inventive way to tell the story. So Michael Bennett, as you heard in the clip there, he interviewed real actors. He kind of did it workshop style. And it really points to the hard life that it is to be on Broadway, physically, emotionally. Auditioning is difficult, and it is these people seeking approval. So Chorus Line ran for many, many years and has some really wonderful songs. There is a movie version. If you've never checked it out, I highly recommend it. All right, Chicago came out the exact same year, and the thing I really want you to remember about Chicago is Bob Fosse. Bob Fosse was a choreographer who did Pippin and lots of other musicals, but his choreography was so different. It was so set apart from what was going on in the traditional American musical. And there was a lot of hip movement, right? There was a lot of hats and canes and rolling of the wrists, and it was very different from what we had seen from other choreographers. But people would go to Chicago or to Pippin or something like that just to see Fosse's choreography. Cabaret, how am I forgetting Cabaret? story of Chicago, if you've never seen it before, is a searing critique of how we as Americans see famous people and glamorize murder and these horrible things, and you can get away with it in America. So it has sort of a tinge of cynicism. I have to bring up the single ladies video. This is like my little soapbox that I crawl on every time. Beyonce had the very unusual single ladies video, and she shot it all in one take, and it was just 3 women standing there dancing. And people asked, like, where did this come from? Well, it came from a Bob Fosse video that she had seen, and a lot of the choreography, a lot of the hip movements, a lot of the wrist action is just directly taken from Bob Fosse's choreography, and a video that she had seen of his wife dancing with 2 other women, and something that he had choreographed. So, but there's a lot of art that people just look at and say, oh, it's so Fosse-esque, and that's a big tribute to how much of an artist he was. All right, Sweeney Todd. If you have never seen Johnny Depp as Sweeney Todd, I highly recommend it, but I actually really like the first recording with Angela Lansbury as well. I mean, that is a great recording of Sweeney Todd. Gosh, I could talk about Sondheim all day. He has, I like the quote on the bottom of page 253, disturbing plots, ironic and sometimes cynical tone, brutal skepticism about conventional morality, highly sophisticated adult and intricately rhythmed lyrics are kind of the marks of a Sondheim. They are thoughtful and eloquent lyrics. They often read like poetry. One of my favorite songs from Sweeney Todd is Pretty Women. And the 2 were sort of just soliloquizing about how women are like flowers and they brighten your day. And it's just beautiful poetry to listen to. He almost always did something completely different for every musical that he did. He would pick a completely different setting, a completely different kind of story. He has the infamous assassins. They talk about in your book different people who've attempted assassination of American presidents. And then we look at something like Into the Woods, which is a fantasy. Cinderella shows up, Little Red Riding Hood shows up. Then Sweeney Todd is a story in turn of the century England. So there's lots of different kinds of, Pacific Overtures was recently done in Nashville, which is a kabuki inspired. It's Japanese, and tells sort of the hard relationships between American and Japanese troops. So anyway, Stephen Sondheim is really a fascinating figure in American musicals, and I'm just so excited always to see what he's going to put out next that we can attempt to sort of recreate the American musical. The Phantom of the Opera is here. Can you tell I love musicals? We're on page 256, and I will never forget the first time that I saw Andrew Lloyd Webber's Cats. As a little 5th grade girl, my heart just exploded in my chest. I could not believe people could put on cat makeup and dance and move so beautifully. And all of these foreign invasions, the Andrew Lloyd Webber shows, are larger than life. We have a big chandelier in Phantom of the Opera, a big helicopter in Miss Saigon, really huge spectacle going on there. So, Les Mis kind of falls into the same 1970s, 1980s import play, even though it's not an Andrew Lloyd Webber. It was definitely in that same era and produced by the same guy. He brought in all of these imports. ABBA came later on with Mamma Mia. Always big, huge turning stages and larger than life costumes and sets, and part of this really hurt the American actor sensibility when we had so many of these actors coming from the West End in London, and it came like in vogue to do those import plays rather than doing good old American musicals. All right, now we get into Disney, which we've already talked about The Lion King and my love of that musical. But it did, when Beauty and the Beast came out, and so many of these Broadway greats had worked on these Disney musicals, they really just were exactly in the same traditions of the American Broadway musical. We saw the same poses, we saw the same musical transitions, just all of it. If you look at Little Mermaid and how quickly it went and how easily it transitioned into a stage play is just a testament to these Broadway veterans and the way that they chose to write the plays. And Beauty and the Beast really kind of started the whole thing going. It definitely changed New York City. Rudy Giuliani went in and kind of got rid of the nightlife, the adjacent nightlife on 42nd Street, closed down a lot of strip clubs, washed a lot of spray paint off of walls in order to get Disney to invest in Broadway. And it really is a good thing that he did, because so much of the American Broadway has been revitalized by these big corporate sponsors. If you look at something like Wicked, that is sponsored by Universal Studios, and so part of its commercial success is that Universal Studios gave them a pretty much unlimited budget before they opened. The producers, this is Mel Brooks. He's one of my favorite writers. He is very famous for doing movies first, right? One of my favorite, Men in Tights. I know it's not his most famous. Young Frankenstein. Mel Brooks has also done Blazing Saddles. So if you've seen some of his movies, his plays are much in the same vein. Director-choreographer Susan Stroman is very famous for her clever use of dancing props. So as you saw that clip of the producers where the old women are dancing and using their walkers and kind of doing these tap routines with their walkers, Stroman, famously has done lots of pieces like that where she's used props. And she's got a great sense of humor, which is why she kind of goes so well with Mel Brooks. She's done several of his projects. The plot is sort of a love story to Broadway, as they said in the clip. Producers, remember, the ones who raised the money, and he teams up with an accountant to make money from a flop, and so they do this sort of homage to Hitler, and if you've never seen this movie, again, Will Ferrell, it makes a hilarious as the writer in Hitler Adoration. And I know I said I was only going to talk about 10 musicals, but if you turn over to page 261, they do bring up some of these really unconventional plot lines in American musical happening today. And one of my favorites here is Next to Normal, which is about a housewife with bipolar disorder, and she is seeing a son who has died long ago. And Spring Awakening famously used the F word a lot. So we just see these sort of really hard issues being tackled in today's modern musical, and really poetically said. So whether it's a mental breakdown or it's the light-hearted razzle-dazzle that we expect from American musical, it's all art, and it's exciting to see where the American musical will go from here. So that's just a little look into the American Broadway. I know that there's a lot of musicals that I didn't touch on, and I would be happy for us to chat about those. Any musicals that you hopefully go to see as your production that you watch this semester. So just in summary, this is musicals, particularly as they pertain to Broadway. It is an American art form that I am proud of, and that I hope you have grown in appreciation for as well. Thank you for listening.